Hello everyone, my name is Cody McCain. I will be doing a critique of Darwin's Evolutionary Origin to Moral Knowledge. I worked on this with Professor Yekel in his Philosophy 375 course. So for Darwin, ethics is going to serve something greater than the individual. It's going to serve what he calls the tribe. This is just any sort of collective of human beings. He's going to argue that humans approve of conduct which benefits the tribe and they disapprove of conduct which doesn't. Darwin's language is echoing a popular ethical theory at this time in Britain called hedonistic utilitarianism. Hedonistic utilitarianism argues that what is the most moral action is that which brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. He's going to trace this to two factors in our evolutionary history: giving and receiving aid, and praise and blame from others. Darwin is arguing that habits are biologically inheritable. Of course, he is a man of his time, so we have to, give him a little bit of leeway. But he argues that because there's a biological basis for hedonistic utilitarianism, we're innately endowed with moral knowledge. He's going to need this to cross the is-ought gap. The is-ought gap is a problem in ethics that argues that you cannot arrive at an ought statement, we ought to do something, without first assuming some other ought statement. So I can't say this is, that is, these are, those are, and then say we ought to do something. I would have to assume another ought statement. But if there's a biological basis for moral knowledge, like Darwin's arguing here, then we can cross the is-ought gap. Darwin's going to run into some problems though. So assume moral theory M has a demonstrated and evolutionary origin. So we have evidence of it and it happened at some point in our evolutionary past. Assume M is not equivalent to some other moral theory, U. Is the origin for M the same as the origin for U? If it isn't, which evolutionary origin would be more correct? That is, which origin is the correct origin for moral knowledge in human beings? If so, then which moral theory better models that one evolutionary origin? Right? So we have one, and which one better models it? Which one's more accurate? So the problem for Darwin is that if he's going to assert that there's this evolutionary origin to hedonistic utilitarianism, in light of these thought experiments, he's going to have to either assert which origin ought to be considered more correct, or which moral theory ought to be considered the better model. Both of these are ought statements. This would imply that Darwin did not cross the is-ought gap because he had to assume an ought statement within his argumentation. But Darwin can push back on this. So one example is crustaceans have independently evolved into crabs no less than 5 times. One crab is not more crab-like, they're all crabs. So he can use this to rebut against the no outcome. That is, there's not one more correct evolutionary origin. Maybe there are multiple evolutionary origins to moral knowledge. Newton and Leibniz, another example, they both invented calculus, but one version of calculus is not considered the better or more accurate model of continuous change over time. They both model it. So he can use this to push back against the yes outcome and say, look, we can have two models that are both accurate, that both model the one evolutionary origin of moral knowledge. Yet, in presenting this third alternative, he runs again into two problems. So let's suppose we have two human groups, H sub 1, H sub 2. They both have a demonstrated evolutionary origin for moral knowledge. However, the evidence that we have could support M or not M, or contradicting moral theories. What has happened is we have jumped from one dilemma to another dilemma. So there's this pattern of presenting dilemmas with two normative consequences that Darwin needs to assert in order to have his evolutionary origin to moral knowledge work, and therefore he doesn't cross the is-ought gap, and then he can present a third alternative. And we can keep doing this forever, essentially. So what does this imply? This implies that we cannot use moral claims, nor can we use epistemic claims to get past the is-ought gap, because even then we're going to assert some sort of normative premises.